Hello friends, welcome to my studio. My name is Kris, and in this video I'm going to show you how I painted this rural road near my home in watercolor. It's a rather normal, even boring kind of scene, as you can see here in the reference image, but by capturing the light and by focusing on those beautiful patterns of light and shadow, I'm able to turn it into a real captivating scene. So let's get started. First thing you're going to see that I do here is I'm sketching it out on my paper. This is a 9 by 12 inch block of watercolor paper. I like to use Ba Hong 100% cotton paper. And I use full sheets of paper, but sometimes I also use a block of paper, which is what you see here. I'm going to just quickly jump to the end of the sketching process. You can see here, it's a little hard to see, but I've got the main elements of the scene, the road edge, the perspective lines, the tree lines, the garbage cans, the mailboxes, all of that sketched in. So now I'm ready to get going. I'm going to go ahead and mix up a nice blue. I'm using a cerulean blue, which I really like to use for my sky color. It's not just cerulean. I'm kind of mixing in a little bit probably of cobalt blue as well. I often do not use just a pure single pigment of color. I like to mix things up a bit. I'm going fairly dark here, and I'm just going to take my big quill brush. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite Quill number 6. Love this brush. I have a video about it. It's got a really fine point, beautiful fine point, but also a big belly of that holds a lot of water and pigment. So as you can see as I go along here, I can kind of paint almost all the way across the paper here or halfway across without reloading the brush because there's so much water and pigment in the brush. And that is what's so important. But yet it still has a fine point. So I can go from kind of big wash to smaller details, painting around things um, with one brush. And that's really cool. All right. Yeah, again, I'm just going to paint in. What I'm thinking about right now, excuse me, what I'm thinking about is not wanting to let that edge dry out too much. And I need to now switch to my other colors. I'm looking and squinting at the reference image, and I'm seeing that in that tree line, which is the next part of the painting here, um, there is kind of a reddish and brownish color um, that I see in those trees to the left. And so I'm mixing that up. You can see that color there. Um, and I'm also saying, well, I also need some grayish color, so I'm going to kind of get some of that ready as I prepare to paint this painting. Um, Again, I want to keep that that line, that bead of watercolor, the bead of water there, fresh, and so I got to mix this up quickly and start moving along that edge before it dries. If I don't, I'm going to get a hard edge. Now, it's not the end of the world if I do get a hard edge, but I'm trying to avoid that. So I've got the kind of greenish color more at the top, and then I moved into the browner colors. One thing about a tree line like that, especially in this situation, is that there's light. The light is coming from the right in the reference towards the left. And so the trees that are over there on the left, especially at the top, have a lot of light on them. And so they're more saturated. The color is brighter. You can see the green. But as you get closer to the ground, that color of the trees gets a little bit more neutralized, a little more gray because it's in the shadow. So I'm just going to quickly move across the painting from left to right. And I'm dropping in some green for that larger green tree. I'm just looking at the reference image, seeing the different colors back there. This is a first wash. It's very loose. I have really not too many hard edges at all. It's mostly I'm allowing everything to blend and just create a nice undertone for the painting. I've got a tea consistency of paint, meaning a very thin wash of paint. mostly water and a little bit of paint. Now you might notice that I do have a few hard edges in that tree line, and that's where I've seen a few real light highlights on the sunward side of those poles and trees. There's a few trees and poles that have a very white or light colored side on them, and I want to retain that. Some of those lines are so fine that I won't be able to retain them very well, so I'll come back later and scratch them in when I have my first wash done, and others I will come back and use some white gouache and paint over and get the white back in. But a few of the largest poles, I'm leaving the white as I see it right now, and that's creating a hard edge, and that will I'll use that to define those poles a little bit later. I'm going to speed this process up here. I've just about painted the tree line. I'm seeing some darker edges there near the ground. Okay, I've come to a very important part of this painting, and that is capturing the light as it hits the road. And so I've mixed up more of my blue. Again, this is a cerulean blue. I think a bit more of a cobalt in it as well. And I am carefully painting, starting from the perspective point way at the end of the road and moving down along that snowbank on the right and filling in that area. I see a variety of colors there, mixing a little gray. I'm going to speed this up a bit. Now, it's really important that as you paint these streaks of light, that you get the angle correct. The light is coming from the right towards the left, and it is casting shadows from the trees across the road. And again, you want to take special care to look at your reference image and get the angle of those streaks of light correct, because if you don't, it'll look off. It'll look a little strange. I'm retaining the white of the paper wherever I see the bright white light of the sun hitting the road. I'm still working that somewhat wet edge that's transitioning from the trees into the blue of the snow and the road. I've got my cerulean blue, cobalt blue mixture. As you get closer to the point, or closer to the foreground, those streaks of light get wider or bigger. The streaks of light that are way off in the distance are very thin, very slight. And then now you can see here, I've got a much bigger patch of light right there in the middle ground. So I'm making sure I keep that. That's going to give a sense of distance as those lines of light get bigger as you come towards the foreground. Also, the angle of the light tends to change a bit as, again, you move towards the foreground because of the perspective. The angle of the light is changing as it gets closer to the foreground. Mixing a little bit of Quin Rose here because I see a little bit of a purple cast in the foreground, and so I want to capture that as well. And now I've got a big swath of blue, that snow that's in the foreground. I'm going to, this is again just my first wash, so I'm doing this very light tea consistency paint. A little later in the painting process, I will come and darken these shadows a bit more. But right now I'm just trying to get to cover the paper for the most part with this first light wash. And I'm just about done with the first wash, and I'm going to let it dry. Here is the painting at the end of the first wash. I'm going to just walk away for about 20 or 30 minutes and let this dry completely before I go into the next step. Okay, here I am now. The painting is completely dry. I'm going to paint the big middle shapes. I've mixed up various colors. I've got kind of an orangey brown, that's raw sienna. I've got some greens that are mixed up with green gold and indanthrone blue. I have some grays, which are a combination of cobalt blue and probably neutral tint. And all those colors I see in that tree line. Now, the tree line is much darker than I painted it in the first wash. Again, the first wash is just to tone the paper, get some undertones in there, so that as I go back with these darker colors, I can let some of those lighter colors shine through. I can create texture by leaving some of the lighter color and the darker color next to each other. And I'm just squinting at my reference image and just following this line of color of the tree line from the left side to the right. I work left to right usually just because I'm right-handed, and so I don't want to paint or move my hand across the wet paint. And kind of seeing the tree lines, especially up at the very top where they touch up against the sky. I want to get a little bit of detail in there of the top of these fir trees. I'm going back, getting some water on my brush and coming back and making some soft edges by blurring the edge of those. You can see I'm letting some of the lighter color of that first wash just shine through, give some texture and contrast. And I'm just going to slowly move across this tree line. This is somewhat of a repetitive process, and so I'm just going to speed up the video here a bit. Now, as I get to the right side of the tree line, it's a bit more of a cool color, so I'm mixing out more of a gray. That's because, again, the light is shining from the right to the left, and so the trees on the left are more bathed in light, and so they have a warmer color to them, whereas the trees on the right are more in the shadow, and so they are a bit bluer in color, gray and bluish color. And if you look closely at the reference image, you can see that. You can see a much warmer set of trees on the left than on the right. And so I'm coming through and doing that. I'm still using that same brush that I've been using the entire time, that Princeton Aqua Elite number 6 quill. You can see the fine lines I can get with it. I'm kind of switching back and forth to a smaller brush at times where I want to get a really fine line, but I can do a lot of with this one brush. I'm mixing a bit of green. I see some bit more of a green color in there as well. And I'm just going to finish this tree line from left to right. Okay, now it's time to get back to the snow and add the darker shadows of the snow. It's interesting, as you paint your paintings, you're going to notice that that first wash that you put down looked pretty dark when you put down those shadows. But then as soon as you start putting in darker values, like the tree line back there, all of a sudden the foreground, middle ground look kind of too light. They are not dark enough. And if that's because value is relative, so something looks dark only in relationship to the other values around it. And now that we've got some darker trees in there, we realize we need darker shadows in the shadows in the snow across the road. So I've mixed up a darker, thicker mix of paint and pigment there. It's more of a probably a coffee or milk consistency of paint. I'm using cobalt blue. I'm using cerulean blue. I've mixed in a little bit of quinacridone rose to give it some purple at places. And I'm following the same pattern of light and dark. I'm keeping those white areas of light on there, but I'm just darkening it a bit and not painting over all of the light areas that I painted in the first wash, because again, I want to let some of those lighter values shine through, creating texture, creating a variety of values in the foreground and middle ground. I'm careful to get the edges of the road defined on the right and the left side with a little bit darker value. I'm also painting around those mailboxes on both sides. I don't have to paint around them entirely because the mailboxes are pretty dark, generally speaking. They're almost a black color, but there is some snow on the top of the mailboxes, and there's some light shining on the lightward or light facing side of the mailboxes, so I want to make sure I retain that. So I'm kind of going slow around the mailboxes, and I'm just carefully putting in some darker values throughout those shadow areas. Now I have finished the middle wash at this point, and I'm getting ready to put in the dark. So I'm going to mix up a bunch of dark paint, much darker paint. You can see it here on the right on my palette. And I started just going through and identifying the really darkest areas of the painting. We can see I've put some of those in already. I've got the very dark trees that are in the midground. I have got the two mailboxes that are much darker, and that there's a garbage can about in the middle ground there on the left side of the road that I've painted in as well. Those are all painted with a mixture of burnt umber, little neutral tint, probably some blue mixed in there as well, just to get a nice, very dark color on those different detail areas. Those detail areas are important. The viewer's eye is going to be attracted to those high contrast areas where you have a very dark object that's up against a lighter background area, and that's the case with all of those objects. And so I've been very careful to get the shapes right, to maintain a light and dark side, to get the highlights correct where the light is shining on those objects. Now, as I evaluate the painting at this point, I've noticed that there really needs to be much darker shadow areas, especially on the right side of the painting. Again, those areas are in the shadow. The light is coming from the right, so many of these trees there on the right are dark in shadow. And so I've mixed up a very dark green color. That green is pretty neutralized. It's a green gold mixed with some indanthrone blue to make it dark, but also even some neutral tint. I've also mixed up a darker gray color. The tree on the far right is been painted in, and it's fairly dark. And then I'm also going to come in and paint the really dark trunks and limbs of trees there all along the right hand side. You can see I'm doing that. I have switched to a little smaller brush using both a number 8 long round Princeton Aqua Elite, and even at times I switch to my number 1 liner. When I want really thin lines, very precise lines, I'll go to my liner, number 1 Princeton Aqua Elite liner. And along the snow line there, you can see there's also sort of a bluish color, the shadow on the snow, putting that in. There are tracks through the snow from tires on the roadway, putting those in. There's more shadow over on the left-hand side. I want to make sure I get that. At times I also take and just put in, especially in the foreground, just use some raw sienna and put in just lines that represent grasses that are kind of showing along the edge of the roadway. They're poking through the snow, and kind of mixing up some really dark colors here, using burnt umber and some blue and all, and mixing up colors for the mailbox. If you look closely at that mailbox on the right, it has kind of a rusty color to it, so I mixed in some burnt sienna as well. And of course, it's so important to get those shapes correct, the shapes that represent those focal areas, the mailbox and all. Using that liner again, now I'm coming back with very thin lines and putting in the trunk of the tree. You don't need to put a lot of detail in there. You just have to represent that there's a tree there, a trunk line, and get that in. Now I'm pretty happy with this painting at this point, so I pause. I'm going to add my signature. As you can see here, I like to add my signature in a bright color. So I've chosen the red and putting that in along the right-hand corner. Then I'm going to go ahead and let the painting dry and come back and evaluate it to see if it needs a little bit more. Now, it is really important to evaluate your painting, and so I've done that here and really felt like I needed to darken the values in that tree line along the right especially, and some of those larger trees on the left. So I did that. And then once that was done, I realized I have lost some of the really light highlights that are important. This is a bright, sunny scene, and so the right-hand side of every object that's facing the sun is going to have a lot of light on it. And so I want to capture that. And those really fine details are hard to maintain those in watercolor when you're painting these big washes. So I'm coming back with a fine liner brush and some gouache. I've literally got a tube of white gouache paint in my left hand, and I'm just dipping the brush right into the tube of paint, getting pure paint that has not been diluted at all, and very carefully and very judiciously, carefully, painting in white highlights. You don't want to overdo this process. You don't want too much white gouache. It just doesn't have the same quality or look as the transparent watercolor, but it really can add a sparkle to your painting. It can really help to define some things. I'm painting in some of the power lines that are capturing the white light, parts of the poles and the trees on the left, along the top of the snow that's on each of the mailboxes there. These types of areas I want to define carefully with a little bit of white gouache. It's a nice way to add some sparkle to your paintings. There you go. Now that I've finished creating a nice contrast between dark areas, shadow areas, and bright highlights, and the white of the light on the snow, I feel like this is complete. Here's my finished painting. And again, I have taken a fairly drab or nondescript scene that you see here in my reference image, and I've turned it into a pretty captivating scene, which I'm pretty pleased with. And now I'm going to go ahead and take my palette knife and separate this one top sheet from the rest of the block. Just carefully move around the outside edge with your palette knife and remove this sheet from the block. And then I have a finished painting. Hope you've enjoyed this process. I really enjoyed doing this painting. I love painting scenes from my everyday life. This is literally from a road near my home where I like to walk regularly. And the light on this particular day just captivated me, and I had to paint it. I'm glad you could share this process with me. Hope you enjoy these tutorials. If so, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification button so you stay notified when I put out new paintings. I put out new tutorials pretty often, about once a week or more, and I'm glad to have you join me. For more watercolor resources, both free and premium tutorials, check out my website at studio.krisdebruine.com. And I also have a whole bunch of tutorials here on my YouTube channel, so I encourage you to check those out. Hope you have a great day, that you keep on painting and you keep on growing in watercolor. I'll see you next time.